And last time we took a cursory look at some of these slides. We're going to take a deeper dive. So, women should remain silent in the churches. They're not allowed to speak, and this actually goes for everybody while I'm talking. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. For it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. And if that weren't bad enough, let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. What a doozy. So we're going to get into these passages through thinking in part through the kind of Roman context of Paul's world, the Jewish context of Paul's world, and we're actually going to take a deep dive into the passages themselves and see what Paul's actually saying. One kind of preface is, if you imagine that all the kind of worst predictions of the outcomes of climate change are actually not as bad as what's going to happen, and in 1,000 years we live in some sort of post-apocalyptic science fiction wasteland, and then people have to wear gas masks, and there's only a population of 6 people or whatever, and they go back through 20th century television, and they find a show in which someone is driving a car. And they might say oh, it's one of those pro-car shows, they wanted to do this is their whole thing. When in fact, in this episode of Mr. Ed, it's not pro-car, it's not anti-car, it's not an agenda, they're just talking about the world that they live in. So I think sometimes it's easy to look back on the morality of a period 2,000 years ago and say they should have known better, this is this campaign to oppress other people, and sometimes that's definitely the case. But at other times, they are just commenting on the world in which they live. And that's not giving Paul a pass. That's just kind of one thing to keep in mind, I think. So let's look at what that world was. So as I mentioned last time, this is the Roman Empire. So it goes all the way up here from Londinium and Eboracum in Britain, all the way over here to the Middle East. So you have all these dioceses, familiar term. Those are states or provinces in the Roman Empire. The maroon ones are Latin-speaking, the orange ones are Greek-speaking, but it is very much all one empire, one ethos, one dominant culture, and lots of kind of subjugated cultures within that. So we have all these amazing, this looks like it was painted in 1957. Here it is, young starlet starring in a movie about Troy or whatever. This is from probably about 150 BC. So all these images of Roman women that I'm going to be showing you, these are actual paintings from between 200 years before the life of Christ to about 100 years after the life of Christ.
Where are they from?
They're all from Egypt. So there was lots of Roman painting. Most of it hasn't lasted. Egypt has a very dry climate, which preserved these. So as I mentioned last time, there's this crucial Roman concept of infirmitas sexus, which is that women are considered, and again, as I said last time, if this doesn't raise your hackles, there's something wrong with you. This is bad stuff. But for the Roman Empire, women were considered very fallible and weak, and they were minors under the law for the whole of their lives. So in the way that my kids can't open a credit card or join the army or vote or whatever, women were that for the entirety of their lives, and everyone had a guardian. As I mentioned last time, this is the paterfamilias. This guy, it's paterfamilias. So he has patria potestas, which means the paterfamilias, the head of the family, has the power of life and death over every member of that family. So if Junior sneaks out of the house and doesn't come back till 2 a.m, Dad can kill him with legal impunity. And there are some cases in which Roman culture encourages Dad to kill him. It's better for the family. So a lot of this power was often exercised when a female child was born. Female children were often exposed and just left to die. And it means now, today, if you're looking back through Roman grave inscriptions, we have so many more for men than women, because the population was very weighted towards men. So that meant there were virtually no unmarried women in the Roman Empire, because there were fewer women than men. So if a Roman woman were married cum manu, so has anybody ever been to a kind of 1928 prayer book wedding in which the priest asks who gives this woman to be married to this man, and then the father sort of hands her hand to the new husband? That's actually from a Roman marriage. This is a pre-Christian rite, and this is the conferral of my property to another man. It's giving your chattel, it's from one man to another, this piece of property who is this woman. Again, vile, bad stuff. It can be a cute tradition, removed of its creepy Roman stuff, but like, in its origin, not good. So if she were married without doing this, then her father remains her guardian for her whole life. If she's given in manu, then the husband becomes the guardian. If the husband dies and she's widowed, if her father's not around, then they would pick someone else from the family to be her guardian for a life. When the father dies, his property gets not evenly, but his property gets distributed among the children. And so even female children inherit, but they have no control over what happens to their property. It's their guardian who is investing it, who is withdrawing the profits, who is doing whatever, ostensibly on their behalf. And I see Elizabeth Fisher entering the room, and she's like a real classicist with real, deep knowledge of all these things, so Elizabeth, correct me, feel free. So most young women in ancient Rome would receive an education in domestic tasks, and maybe even elementary literacy. But fluent reading and writing, this is reserved for women who have private tutors, very small percentage of the population. So at 14, when a boy was going on to secondary education, training him in rhetoric and so forth, preparing him for public life, a girl would be entering her first marriage. As I mentioned last time, further education was mostly an inducement to getting a better marriage contract. So Pliny the Younger speaks of his wife Calpurnia's literary attainments. She keeps copies of my work to read again and again, and even learn by heart. She's even set my verses to music and sings them to the accompaniment of her lyre, with no musician to teach her, but the best of masters, love. This is what women's education is for, impressing your husband. So all women were expected to marry. This is not like a vague societal expectation. If you were under 50, you legally had to marry and try and have children. So for wealthy Romans, so we have this, as you may remember from every Christmas pageant you've ever been to, a decree went out from Augustus Caesar that all the world had to be registered. That's actually the case. And we know from the census data that we have from Augustus's registration of everyone, there are about 5 million Roman citizens at the time, 14 years before Christ was born, or so. This actually concludes in AD 14, so in that kind of window of the before Christ and halfway through Christ's life. So about 3 to 10%, a really tiny percent, would live in the traditional Roman house, the domus. So the domus is this very graceful, beautiful Roman mansion. And in the way that we make airports basically the same everywhere in the world, if you get off the airport in Houston or Amsterdam or Dubai, you can probably find luggage claim because they're all kind of the same. The domus is the same. So if you go to a traditional Roman house somewhere in Great Britain, or somewhere in Palestine, or somewhere in Egypt, or somewhere in Germany, it's the domus. It's the same house. So the matron would oversee kind of life in this house. This is in a sense like her domain of authority, but it's always authority subject to the paterfamilias. So you have this kind of traditional design in which you have this entrance, and there might be like stores in the front of your house, which you would rent out to someone. You have a little pool of water, such that if there's something wrong with the aqueducts, you always have basic water for drinking and washing. You have, over here would be the eating area, the triclinium. We have the tablinum here, which is kind of this symbolic room in which like Romanitas, the idea of Rome, is sort of on display. You have a garden back here, and then you have kitchens off the garden. So her time would be spent overseeing a big household of enslaved people, so managing all these enslaved people. She would spend time managing the stores of the house, and then she would also work with wool, so spinning and weaving. Even as a really wealthy Roman matron, she would still work in wool and oversee also domestic production of other things like cheese and olives. So again, this kind of an illustration of the layout of one of these Roman houses. And you can go see the ruins of these basically all over the ancient world, but they're really well preserved in places like Herculaneum and Pompeii. Again, like, this is not Delacroix. You know, this is a 1st century BC painting. Isn't that shocking? It's so cool. So, a Roman matron's primary role was to keep an orderly household, to be pleasant, and to work the loom. A bride in her wedding carried the implements for working with wool, the spindle and distaff. And so weaving and spinning thread may have been kind of like needlework and music and painting for a 19th century, or 18th century upper class woman, like Jane Austen character life. So this is a funereal inscription. Friend, I have not much to say. Stop and read it. This tomb, which is not fair, is for a fair woman. Her parents gave her the name Claudia. She loved her husband in her heart. She bore 2 sons, one of whom she left on earth, the other beneath it. She was pleasant to talk with, and she walked with grace. She kept the house and worked in wool. That is all. You may go. And this is very high praise. Like, she fulfilled all the duties of a Roman matron. So this is from, there's a really epic study from 1992 called Women in Late Antiquity by an Oxford historian. This is what she says. A widow sui iuris, meaning managing her own affairs with only token reference to her guardian, and old enough, that is 50, to escape the obligation to remarry and have more children, was Rome's nearest approach to a legally independent woman. There cannot have been many such, and there were no career women. What career, after all, was open? Ouch. One area in which women were active in public life to some extent, for the wealthy, was Roman religion. So you might not be able to work outside of the home, but you might be a priestess in one of the shrines devoted primarily to a female goddess. So Roman clergy did not go to seminary. They didn't have any special theological education. There was no kind of preparation for being a Roman priest. It was kind of a symbolic office, like the head of the Rotary Club or something like that. And you would serve for a couple of years, and you would take an active part in processions and public banquets and so forth. This is true for men and women. A Roman matron would also have this kind of responsibility for the worship of the household gods. So there are these little gods that live in your house. And there are gods that watch over your food stores, gods that watch over your possessions, and they're the gods of your family ancestors. So this is like a little lararium. This is from Pompeii, I think. And this is from Plautus. So it's 3rd century BC. I am the lar familiaris. This is like this household god talking. A member of this family, from which you have called me. I own this house since many years, and I cherish the forefathers of its present owner. He has a daughter who cherishes me, and prays for me every day with gifts of wine or incense. She gives me garlands. So Greco-Roman religion was kind of one place in which women had like a public role and a kind of important role in and outside the house. You have other cults like the Vestal Virgins, in which you have these like elite kind of priestesses who serve for 30 years at a time. So this is one of the Vestal Virgins. This is the temple, this is a recreation of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. And this is literally one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This is like one of the biggest temples on the planet. this really important cult. This is, have you ever heard of the Amazons? Not the Jeff Bezos kind, but the other kind. The Amazons were ostensibly worshipped Artemis of Ephesus, the great Artemis. So you have these Amazons here. This is from the mysteries at Eleusis, which were kind of one of the most important rites of the ancient world. You see both men and women engaged in these kind of symbolic roles at Eleusis. What about the other 90 to 95% of Roman women? So urban Romans lived in insulae. These are like giant apartment complexes in urban areas. And so a family might rent 1 or 2 rooms. So you have like, and this is obviously a modern illustration, but you can kind of see in here like sort of a big room and somebody's kind of warming his feet or cooking something over the fire. Over here someone is preparing something. You have like sort of a tavern here and storefronts here. But it was a pretty grim tenement life for urban Romans. And down the corner you have a little teeny tiny farmhouse. For rural Romans, they lived in like rural poverty, as you would expect. Working class Roman women would often have very little education, might marry early, and live a life divided between hard labor within the home and rearing children. What about enslaved women? So enslaved people made up probably 30 to 40% of the population of the Roman Empire. So this is again from Gillian Clark's Women in Late Antiquity. Ancilia, which may mean anything from maid of all work to lady's maid. Obviously the second was a better chance, since she could collect tips and win her mistress's or master's favor. She might have special skills. Some slave girls were dressers, hairdressers, dressmakers, wool workers. If a slave girl were free, it did not much enlarge her possibilities. She might be a housewife, doing much the same work as an Ancilla did, but in her own home. Housework was hard. There was spinning and weaving and sewing and mending, cooking and cleaning, and water carrying and baby minding. So we have, this is a wealthy young Roman woman, and this is the enslaved woman who's doing her hair. It's a first century portrait. What about Judaism? Any better? Nope, sadly. This is from, superscription's very small, but this is Leonine Archers, the role of Jewish women in religion, ritual, and cult of the Greco-Roman Palestine, a book I'm sure you're all familiar with. Women had no share in the system of formal schooling which flourished in Palestine during the Hellenistic period, and in consequence of their ignorance of the law, were further removed from the possibility of giving public expression to their piety. If women did accompany their menfolk to the temple, when the latter were fulfilling the command to appear before the Lord, then their role was one of passive onlooker rather than active participant. For they were not allowed into the inner precincts where the main activity of the cult, that is, the sacrifice, was conducted. So you have this area is sort of, here is the court of the Gentiles, so anybody can come in this area. This is the court of women, and this is as far as you could come if you were a Jewish woman. Here, Jewish men could come, and then here the priests, and then here the high priest could come. But you existed at a level of remove in the liturgies. As a general extension of women's exemption from the time-geared precepts, in consequence of their non-obligation to study Torah, women were not required to attend the synagogue. Only men could make up the quorum of 10, which was necessary for a service. And if less than 10 men were in attendance, even though women were present, the congregation, to use the words of the Mishnah, may not, so you can't sort of hold the service if you don't have enough people. And even if there are like 300 women present, you still can't hold the service unless you have 10 men. According to the Talmud, everybody is qualified to get up and read the Torah scrolls, but women really shouldn't, out of respect for the congregation. So, bleak picture for half of our population in these times. So this is the time in which Paul is writing this stuff. So he says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. So initially he's saying, I desire in every place men should not be manly Romans. You shouldn't be full of violence, you shouldn't be full of dominance, you should come before the Lord in prayer. And also that women should dress themselves modestly and decently in suitable clothing. not with their hair braided, or with gold or pearls or expensive clothes. In this society, a woman's dress, and the book I mentioned, Women in Late Antiquity, gets deep into this. A woman's dress was one of the chief social signifiers for her husband. So you showed off your wealth by the way your wife looked. So your status was reflected by her dress. And Paul is saying, set all that aside. Let's get away from all these Greco-Roman stereotypes of how we should be. And instead, be clothed with good works, which I think is a good word to all of us. And then he says, let a woman learn. So we have this word pantheno here. And this is learn in Greek. This is the almost an identical word to mathetes, disciple in Greek. So he's actually saying, like, women, as they're becoming disciples, should learn in silence. Hesychia, this hesychast is the word that you hear for, like, a very devout monk or nun, like a hermit. It is one who lives in the silence of God. Hesychia gives root to a word for, like, a learned scholar. This is not giving Paul a pass. It's just saying that what he's writing is complicated and weird and interesting. Again, like in this sort of first century Palestinian Jewish world, this idea of the woman even kind of learning in silence as a disciple, this is in itself a kind of challenging thing to the worldview of those around him. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. This is where things get super weird and crazy. So, Alphantes, you can see here, this is from like the very dominant Greek lexicon. What does Alphantes mean? So we translate it as authority. Chief meaning is murder, which is really weird. To murder one's family, perpetrator. It's like a very murder by one of the same family. It has a lot of ramifications with that patrias potesta, this like the paterfamilias's right to murder anyone in his family. So that in itself is very weird. This is a word that does not appear a lot in Greek texts that I found. Like the entry is fairly small. It's a bizarre thing for Paul to say. So there are plenty of good words for authority. There are plenty of good words for having power over. This is not one of them. This is a very strange word. So this is not a simple statement, is all that I want to say. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. A lot of early theologians read this as saying Adam transgressed without being deceived. Adam had greater culpability than Eve. She was tricked by the snake, but Adam was not tricked and yet still sinned and ate. Kind of interesting. And then maybe the weirdest part, yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. So when early church writers are writing about this, they're very explicit in saying, it doesn't mean like if you have a baby you get points with God. This means that all of us are given situations in which we live, and all of us can attain salvation within those situations. So there's an old bluegrass song called I'm Working on a Building, and the singer says, like, if I were like in this state of life, here's how I would work on the building. If I were in that state of life, here's how I would work on the building. So if I were a teacher, I'd tell you what I'd do. I keep right on teaching and I'd work on the building too. If I were X, so that you would find salvation in your state of life. And writing to a population in which every woman had the legal obligation to have children, this was the state of life of all women in the Roman Empire who were biologically able to have children. So, again, not giving Paul a pass, but this is way more nuanced than either A, I might think it is if I want to read this and just dismiss it, and certainly B, than it would be if someone from a fundamentalist perspective wanted to say women shouldn't speak in church, or women shouldn't have authority over men. They're missing the point. They need to read this stuff in the original and pay attention to it. Women should remain silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. This sounds way harder to get out of even in that one. Like, this sounds crazy, especially given its context. So if I said something that contradicted something else I said, like 20 years apart, or talking to like two radically different groups of people, that's inconsistent. But if I write you a letter and I'm like, I would never use a curse word, curse words are so bad, anyone that swears is just awful, and in the next paragraph I'm like, exclamation point, pound sign, asterisk, asterisk, like, you'd be like, what is wrong with you? Like, are you having a stroke? Like, what is this difference? Here's what Paul says right before this. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. He's giving you the dress code for women when they preach in church. Like, to prophecy in church is to get up and speak the word of God to God's people after the reading. So he's like, when a man gets up to preach, he has to take his hat off. When a lady gets up to preach, she has to put a big church hat on. What? He just said remain silent in church, and here are the rules for ladies preaching. What is that about? What do you think? Well, I'll give you a hint where we can look. Let's ask John Chrysostom. So if you read ancient sermons on this text, here's what John Chrysostom says. Having abated the disturbance, both from the tongues and from the prophesying, and having made a law to prevent confusion, they who speak with tongues should do this in turn, and they who prophesy should be silent when another begins. So John Chrysostom is reading this, and he's like, okay, Paul has taken this wild, charismatic, everybody's talking at once thing, and he's sorted it out, such that one person is preaching at a time, one person is getting up to speak at a time. If you have a Quaker meeting and you have 20 minutes of silence and everybody starts shouting at once, nobody's going to come back to that Quaker meeting. So you got to talk one at a time. So he's like, Paul has brought order in this way. He next, in course, proceeds to the disorder which arose from the women, cutting off their unseasonable boldness of speech. For if to them that have the gifts it is not permitted to speak inconsiderately, nor when they will, and this, though they be moved by the Spirit, much less to those women who prate idly and to no purpose. So, again, this is still an ancient world. This is still horribly sexist and weird and crazy times that don't relate to ours. But what John Chrysostom understands this passage is doing is saying there are stoic, serious, Greco-Roman men who would never think of just talking in church in one half of the church, because women and men are on either half of the aisle. And on the other hand, you have these sort of chattery ladies who are asking questions, talking during the service, interrupting things. Pure sexist stereotypes, one way or the other. But he's saying that Paul is saying that you can't have just conversation in the church while the service is going. Again, sexist assumptions, still offensive, but not what a fundamentalist reader would say in saying Sarah should not have preached the sermon this morning. It's something very different. It's more like if I'm talking to Augie during the service, then the priest, Sarah should say be quiet, I'm trying to preach the sermon. Therefore, he represses their babbling with much authority. But if they are not even to speak, says one, nor ask a question, to what end are they to be present? If you can't actually figure out what's going on in the service, why even be present? That they may hear what they ought, but the points which are questioned let them learn at home from their husbands. Wherefore he added, and if they would learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home. So again, super sexist, weird, but think about the standard of education for Greco-Roman women, and for Jewish women at this time. 0. Some domestic tasks, basic literacy, and the presumption is that the men of a certain class, at least, have gone to school and may have some better access to education. Again, sexist, weird, crazy world in which they lived, but not what the fundamentalists make of it, clearly. So lastly, what else did Paul say about women? Uh-oh, here it comes. Just kidding, it's mostly all great. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, There is no male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the purpose. This, in the ancient world, shocking. Like, drop your cup of coffee, offensive. Breaking down the barriers between enslaved people and free people, breaking down the barriers between men and women, this is like unheard of in the Greco-Roman world. This is like tantamount to inciting anarchy. He talks about Priscilla, and he always talks about Priscilla and Aquila. This would be like an MC starting something like, "Welcome, gentlemen and ladies." It sounds backwards to us. It should be ladies and gentlemen. When you're mentioning a couple, you always mention the man first, but Paul always mentions Priscilla before Aquila because she is the greater messenger of the gospel. She is the greater teacher. He talks about the church in their house. He doesn't talk about the church in Aquila's house, as every Greco-Roman would, but the church in Priscilla, who's a woman, and Aquila, who's a man's house. Pretty surprising. Then he says, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchreae, so that you may welcome her in the Lord, as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. For she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well." He calls her Protasis, so she is Paul's patron. She is the one who's like responsible for the good work that Paul has been doing, and she is sent with the epistle to the Romans. So when Paul sends an epistle, he sends it with a messenger. And this is not some guy on a bike who hands it to you and then drives off. This is the person who comes and preaches the epistle in the church. So they read the epistle, and then they're expected to be able to comment on the epistle, answer questions, expound upon the epistle. The first expositor of the epistle to the Romans is this deacon Phoebe. She is the one whom Paul sends to preach his epistle to the church at Rome. Romans 16, greet Mary, who has worked very hard for you. Greet Andronicus and Junia, Junia being a woman's name. So clearly a Roman woman's name that some early Bibles change it to Junio, because they're like, clearly it can't be a lady, because he calls her an apostle. Junia the apostle. Greet the workers in the Lord, Tryphena and Tryphosa. Greet the beloved Persis, who has worked hard in the Lord. This working hard in the Lord, this is the work of the apostles. This is spreading the gospel. This is preaching the gospel. Greet Philologius, Julia. Greet the sister of Nereus and Olympus and all the saints who are with them. Aphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, in the church in your house. Like, he goes over and over again. He is talking about all these women who are ministering in the church. Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. Again, a woman who is overseeing the church. He says of Euodia and Syntyche, these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel. So over and over again, Paul is actually completely breaking with normative Greco-Roman conventions and giving this measure of equality to women in the church that would be abhorrent to basically everybody else in Greco-Roman society. So, if your fundamentalist cousin's like, I still don't understand why you go to that church with that lady preacher, then you can open your Bible and show them why. Questions or thoughts on all this stuff, please?
Yeah, what does the Torah say about women?
That's a good question. I don't know. Are you thinking of a specific part or a specific verse or just in general?
I'm thinking maybe Leviticus or something where there's all these law rules.
Yeah, the Torah is not super worried about women because they're not part of Israel. So they're married into Israel, they're married to the members of Israel, but most of the laws are about Israel. So the positive commandments, I think, this is like way above my pay grade stuff. We should ask a rabbi about this. But I think most of the positive commandments are not binding to the women in the Torah, though the negative commandments are. I think that's right. But we should check that out, because I may be talking through my head. Please?
You described the absolute dominion the man had over minors and women. I'm curious how consistent that was geographically across the whether it was more central to the Italian peninsula or it spread out very quickly, or whether maybe it was imported through conquest. In other words, it was more common than some of the hinterlands that were then incorporated. And how consistent it was temporally from, say, 3rd century BC when Rome really started its conquest through 450 or whatever the falls of Barbarian.
That's such a great question. So the question was about like the paterfamilias' absolute authority over life and death over the whole family, where that was concentrated, or what the trajectory was. So the Roman Empire is it's an urban empire built in rural areas. So the Romans would come in, they would take over your town, they would make you have some measure of fealty to the emperor, they would collect taxes, and they didn't really care about you as long as you weren't rebelling and you were paying your taxes. So they would build a big Roman city in the midst of your area of Hispania or North England or whatever it is. And so in those towns, Romanitas prevailed, like the Roman way of life, the Roman way of doing things. And so this power that the paterfamilias had, this power of life and death over the family, was just a core part of Romanitas. So if you're in a Roman city in Syria or in Italy or wherever, this is the deal. It does wane after you get out of the Republican period and move into the period of the emperors, and I think the sort of further away from Augustus you get, the less and less it seems to be like a normative thing, at least that's exercised. I don't think it really goes away until like the 180s, I think, and there are some changes in Roman law which affect the family, and I think in like the 180s, 80, there is some shifting in that. But in Paul's period, it was very much normative. Again, not that that's what he's necessarily responding to, but that is in the water and in the air and sort of part of this world that he lives in. Anything else? So I think it's easy to be too hard on Paul. I think we can also be too easy on Paul. I don't think that like this stuff is just easy and just something you can dismiss. But I also don't think that the kind of fundamentalist conclusions that are often drawn from it are in any way correct, if that makes sense. And again, if you let Romans 16 or Ephesians or Philemon or Colossians or any of these other texts be your guide, Paul is like a shocking feminist of his day compared to the Greco-Roman world. But if you're just looking at these two passages, they're tough. All right, I'm headed to church. Thank you all.